I have heard some people ask, are you worshiping trees? Or I think it's a question, though, that reveals a lot, because when people worship inside of a building, I don't ask them, do you worship a building rather than God?
Oh, so good.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Katerina.
Hi, Mariah. Great to be with you.
Yes. Welcome to Called to Be Bad. So this is Katerina Gea. Katerina is a gardener, Mennonite pastor, and educator who offers leadership to Wild Church Fresno. She currently organizes around Indigenous justice with the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. And Katerina has an MDiv in Theology and Peace Studies from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, which is where I met Katerina. So that's how we met. And now Katerina's all the way out in California. It's a little bit earlier for you there than it is for me here. And we're talking about your wild church in Fresno. And but before because I don't really know what a wild church is, so we'll learn all about that. But first, I'm curious what you are drinking today.
Oh yeah, I am drinking a ginger tea today because I'm getting over a cold. Usually I would have chai, but today it's herbal, delicious spicy ginger.
I love ginger. When you're sick, like that, just like, have you ever made it fresh?
I have, yeah, with a little bit of honey and lemon. Really good.
Oh, what is I didn't see let me see your mug. Can you describe your mug?
So a neighbor named Al is a potter, and he has his own potter's wheel and stuff in his garage. And he was showing me around one time because I'm really interested in pottery, and I just love like homemade, glazed pottery. And so he let me choose a mug from his little studio. So it's this beautiful green.
That's neat.
On one side, glazed mug. On the other side, it's more like a more rough kind of tan exterior, not glazed.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful craftsman kind of mug that my neighbor Al made.
Yeah. I love that. That's very unique though. Like one side is like almost raw, I want to say, and the other is glazed. Plus that's such a great color of green. Green's my favorite color. And so I'm always looking for that, like that green that I love. Yeah. And so today I have coffee, and I have my Colorado mug. I don't remember where I got it. I think my mom might have gotten it for me, because when I realized we're talking about wild church, I don't know, when I think wild, I think Colorado, because that's where I grew up, and I think forests and Rocky Mountain Mennonite Camp. So that's why I picked my Colorado mug.
Nice.
Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast. So I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. Yeah, wild church. What is a wild church? Where did you hear about this idea? Did you come up with it? All the things.
Yeah, great question. I had not heard of wild church or the wild church movement or network really before seminary, maybe 6 years ago or so. And basically a wild church is a church that gathers outdoors without a building. So that's the most basic definition maybe. So we say in our church that we gather in the sanctuary of creation.
Okay.
It's also a model of church that really tries to include the natural world within our community and in worship as well. So sees ourselves as really interconnected with the other than human world or the natural world around us.
Yeah. So you don't own a building at all?
No building, no mortgage.
Okay.
No walls.
Nice.
Yep.
Did you start this church?
I did. I co-founded it with a friend of mine, Julia Baker, after moving back to Fresno, which is near where I grew up after seminary. And we had been going on these Sabbath walks, both during seminary and after. We're really, really good friends, and we're housemates and roommates for a while. And I found like our conversations would often meander and roam to just the world around us as we walked. We, looking at the river that we were walking near or the trees, and we would stop and wonder and kind of like, how did this moss form? Or, where did this kind of, animal migrate from? Or just the curiosity in us that came up, and very kind of contemplative. We called them our Sabbath walks, contemplative wandering time for both of us. And along the way, I think we just started talking about like, why is it that church we have to conceive of as in a building? I think at the time had a short-term pastoral assignment as sort of an interim position and really loved it actually. But whenever I felt the need to be nourished or to encounter God, to encounter Christ, I often went outdoors and when, just on a hike or sit by a stream or under a tree. And I felt like those were the places rather than even the church where I was pastoring, the church building, I should say, where I most encountered God's presence. And so we started to talk about, why is it that we don't hear more about, climate change or the natural world in the churches where we go? What are some ways where we could bring these kinds of conversations together, and why not reimagine church? So I learned after starting actually Wild Church in Fresno with my friend that there's a whole Wild Church network made up of Wild Church communities across North America and beyond. So it's not just us. I feel like the Spirit is sort of up to something, that these ideas and I have to read this quote actually from the Wild Church Network website. It says, "Popping up all over the land like wild mushrooms after a spring rain, Wild Church communities are responding to a call from deep within to change the way we relate to the natural world, moving from a collection of objects to a communion of subjects." That's a quote, the end part there by Thomas Berry. So really shifting the way that we relate to and commune with the earth and see ourselves as part of and not separate from the rest of creation.
So the Wild Church Network, does it function almost like a denomination? Is it a set of principles? Like how is the network kind of connected to each individual Wild Church?
Yeah, the network is not so much a denomination because there's actually wild churches within a lot of different denominations, Mennonite, UCC, Presbyterian, but there's also wild churches who are Buddhist or who aren't within the Christian fold, or are just, non-denominational as well. So it's kind of a loose affiliation. They offer support for wild churches getting started through monthly Zoom calls, through resourcing wild church communities, and they're affiliated or connected to some different kinds of seminary programs that people could take called Seminary of the Wild. And there's some different ways that when you join, you can be resourced and cross-pollinate ideas among different wild churches, but they're not like officially connected denominationally or anything. More of a network of support.
Yeah, that's neat. I love the cross-pollination and the metaphor of the mushrooms popping up. That's beautiful. I want to hear about, I have so many questions. What was it like starting this church? And yeah, we'll start there. What was it like starting the church? Do you have any stories?
Oh, yeah, it was, I mean, it's just been really life-giving for me, I think, as a pastor and community member, to start something that I can also kind of participate in a sense. And that's a little bit lighter version of doing church. Like for the first 2 years or so, I was 3 years maybe. We started in 2019. I was a volunteer, and then just this year started to shift into more of a part-time role with Wild Church as we've grown. But yeah, sometimes we'll gather at we'll gather at different places, and I think what's really fun for me, or what's so life-giving, is that you feel like you're a part of the change of seasons in a sense. Like you go to the spring and we see wildflowers. We meet once a month on the banks of the San Joaquin River usually. Sometimes we meet like an urban community garden or somewhere in the city as well. And then we do an outdoor hike or an immersion experience each month, whether that's like in the giant sequoias. We live like 90 minutes away from like 3 beautiful national parks, or at least within 2 hours of the Yosemite, Kings Canyon, Sequoia National Parks. And so we'll go out there and really seek to create more access for people living in Fresno, which is where I live in the Central Valley in California, to get to these places where sometimes people haven't even gone there because of transportation issues or family or work growing up prevented that. But yeah, we'll carpool to a hike in the giant sequoias, and just this sense of smallness that you get, from being underneath massive trees. I don't know if you've visited before.
I have, and it's making me get the travel bug, the itch to go back. Whenever we'd go on hikes like that, we would always pretend like we're the only people in the whole entire world, and just like be quiet and like, just like pretend that it's just us in the forest.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, that sense of being quiet. And, I think for me, it's really about that reverence and that sense of awe that you get of feeling like the world is so wondrous. There's this sense of beauty and awe and wonder that I think is so healthy and needed for us to experience, to kind of restore our place in the natural world. And I mean that like kind of 2 meanings. Like we need to both restore our place of like restoring the land, restoring what's been harmed and broken and wounded by human domination systems, but also to restore our place in terms of like, we're humans who are part of a larger ecosystem. We're not like the superior being over the ecosystem. So that sense of kind of coming back into our place, experiencing like right relationship within that web of creation and web of relationships. So yeah, that's what it's about for me. And I think, like I was saying, like being along the side of the river, the banks of the river once a month in the spring and the fall, you see the egrets and, Canadian geese coming in. You see the changing of the light over the water. And we always offer people contemplative wondering time, so that it's not just sitting and listening to a sermon and kind of absorbing content, but it's also about a divine encounter with Creator in the wild or in the natural world. And I define the wild as sort of undomesticated spaces outside of human control, that humans are not manipulating or transforming for our own uses, but where we are encountering, that which is beyond our control. And I think that kind of rhythm of gathering and praising and feeling the emotions of both praise and grief that come as we witness creation's beauty, but also the impacts of the ecological crisis that we can't escape from by insulating ourselves by air conditioning, or the wildfires. Really huge last year here in Central California, and this year as well, with the wildfires getting bigger and bigger and more extreme each year, with the droughts, climate chaos. We can't insulate ourselves, like we smell the smoke, we see the fires, we feel the impacts, and it's not just about escape, it's about in kind of immersion into that grief as well as into that beauty.
Yeah. So did the wildfires, did you meet inside then? Did that force you to meet inside, or did you still meet outside? Did you have to like wear masks or anything? I don't know how that would have impact you.
That's a great question. Yeah, that actually is one of the, I would say, only times we've had to cancel Wild Church or meet indoors. I don't think we met indoors that year, but I do think we canceled a service last year because of the wildfire smoke, or else one time we just had to wear those N93 masks to be able to gather safely outside, and we cut our service time short. But that itself was like a wake-up call in a way of saying, like, this is really serious. If we're not able to be outside longer than 30 minutes and breathe because the air is in the purple zone and is 300 PM or whatever it was at that time. And it impacted me personally and my family, as my dad was evacuated. He lives in our family home in the mountains near Yosemite National Park in Mariposa, and for 3 or 4 days we didn't know if our family home was still there because of the fires that were raging through, and they actually stopped within half a mile of the house. But yeah, it's just like that. I think it's not only the kind of romanticized Wild Church image of just always beauty that I think some people get, or like that kind of romantic encounter with nature, but it's also this sense of there's a grief there too, as we step into the felt experience of climate change and its impacts together. Yeah.
So you started this church and with your friend, and then how did word just get out organically? What drew people to your community? What keeps them coming? And do you keep it intentionally small, or how big is your church?
Yeah, we are maybe max around 25 or so. So it is pretty small. Yeah, usually it's like 15 or 20 people who gather in a circle, and we will face each other, and we have a little altar space in the middle that we gather whenever we meet. We'll go out and kind of gather different stones or leaves or pieces of the natural world we find around us, and center around that. And we find like folks love the outdoors, and there's like a big hiking community. And a lot of folks have grown up in the institutional church but haven't returned as adults. Like they've maybe burnt out on church, or have been disaffected or hurt by the church. For example, we have folks who've come who are queer or LGBTQ, and we're open and affirming. And so I think feeling safe to come to a church that gathers where our pews are like, logs or blankets, and we don't have like a sort of church-like look to it. We're not in the kind of space where maybe they've been wounded before, so it can be a healing experience of kind of reintegrating and returning to church community as an open air.
You're kind of redefining what, like, the institution, like the church building. You're kind of breaking down those walls, literally. And I could see how. Go ahead.
I was gonna. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think we're going around on the same path. Like for those who would have triggers or trauma tied to kind of the building or institutional church, like a lot of people, myself included, have a hard time just stepping foot into the building of the church that you grew up in. And so it's a way to encounter church that can be healing, like replacing those bad or traumatic memories with something that is literally natural and yeah, that's cool. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
And it probably is nice for the introverts of your group that you have that kind of reflective alone time of going off and having those, what did you call them?
Oh, like a contemplative wandering time?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it is kind of like a model that works well for introverts, I think, which my friend and I are who started it.
Yeah. We just happened to, be really good for introverts. Yeah. I know a lot of pastors are introverts and really struggle with like and so that's a kind of nice solution to that.
Yeah. And I enjoy the study and the, what goes into preaching and doing a sermon. But what I've been challenged to do is really pare it down to maybe like a couple-minute homily, like 5 minutes, and then to send people out. Like, and I don't preach every time. And we really emphasize, which I actually think, I'm a Mennonite and Anabaptist. I think it is maybe more of an Anabaptist model to have people together on scripture or reflect together after their wonder. Well, we send them out to wonder, and then they'll come back and respond to a question or a reflection, either on the scripture or on what came up for them as they were out during their meditative or prayerful time near the river. And that's always so much richer than anything I could kind of generate, because it's a community conversation. And then we share Eucharist together, and I often will flow into a potluck meal after that too. So.
Okay. So do you have a meal each time?
We have communion each time or Eucharist each time, but just depending on the month, sometimes we don't have a potluck. Like, we kind of have to go according to the season. So if we so in the summertime, it gets to 113 in Fresno or 115 at times. And so we have to start really early and do more of like a brunch kind of thing. But then in the winter, we'll move to the afternoon when it's warmer. And it just depends when it ends, if we have that kind of potluck time afterwards. Yeah.
Fascinating. So you adjust the time based on the weather. That makes so much sense.
Yep. Yeah.
So you're not, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. The church time changes seasonally. So it might be like a, 9 to 11 in the summer, but then it's more of a, 1 to 3 in the winter time. So, yeah.
That I love that, because you are modeling working with nature, like kind of like the same idea as like eating with the seasons, like eating food that naturally comes up in the season, eating locally.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's something about discomfort too. Like, I don't want people to be unsafe or to get heat stroke. But there is also that element of kind of, you can feel it as it starts warming up a little bit more, and we're, when we might go back to our climate controlled environments or whatnot, but there's exposure that happens, or a kind of connection with those cycles of that. Actually, I was inspired by a wild church in Ontario. Wendy Jansen came and spoke at seminary about the Burning Bush Forest Church community. I love their name, the Burning Bush Church.
It's amazing.
About, Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush. But they meet all throughout the year, and that amazes me when people ask, how can you meet, in the wintertime? And I'm like, well, if they're doing it in Ontario.
Right, that's different from doing it in California. Yeah,
right. It's all about the clothing that you wear and how you prepare.
Yeah.
I think have a fire circle, or again, Advent next month, we're going to do a fire outdoors and do church in the dark. And there's something about doing Advent at night where you can see the stars and you have a fire. And last year
beautiful.
I froze these little candle holders that were made of water. So basically had like ice. I was trying to think of a way where the fire wouldn't spread because it's so dry here in the winter. And so I made the candle holders out of ice, and put the candles in ice. And I had like a whole circle of maybe 40 different ice candle holders, and the like light caught the ice and just glowed.
That is
in our
brilliant.
circle around us for Advent. Yeah. And then the ice slowly
That's so
melted,
cool.
protected the flame from spreading. But it was
That is genius. Did you come up with that idea? Did you find that online?
actually, that was an example of a Wild Church Network idea where we were brainstorming. One of the women, I think, got
good.
one of those creative ideas. So the cross-pollination. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, we did church in the dark and really reflected on like images of darkness, why they're sometimes portrayed in negative ways, but like at night, the night heightens our senses. Like we heard owls, we heard random sounds on the water, but like gathering in a circle with the light meeting the darkness, there wasn't that sense of fear. It was kind of like enveloped in mystery, really, and feeling that sense of kind of God moving in the midst of the darkness, and that sense of unknown and wonder that happens at night. So yeah, there's a lot that can happen from meeting at different times of the day. We also made Advent wreaths made of native plants from our regions. We were like learning about the toyon and the sage and the manzanita and like different kinds of plants that grow in wintertime and have beautiful foliage, and just cedar, and just taking in the scents and the feeling of those plants and the gifts that they bring. So it's put us in touch with that sense of what's growing seasonally, and what I feel like in winter or in summer, and what is, we're so often disconnected, I think, and in dominant culture from the natural world. And so it's a way to return, in a sense, or to kind of re-knit some of that kinship and that sense of connection.
Yeah. Also, like, this is, well, I'll quickly say this and then I have a different question, but just like what a model for stewardship, rather than spending all this money on maintaining a building, that is freeing you up to use your resources differently, or to not just pour so much money into, something that works against creation or doesn't keep you in touch with creation. And instead you're able to use your resources differently.
Totally. On that note, at our last service, we were able to donate an air quality monitor. We have like a mutual aid and reparations fund, and we seek to transfer those funds that we would otherwise put into maybe a building or maintaining the structure of the church. We give those funds to local environmental justice groups or individuals or nonprofits who are working at the intersection of racial and environmental healing and justice.
Yes.
And so
it's neat how, because you are so literally in touch with creation and with nature, you are more aware of your impact on nature. And I think that kind of awareness and education, it naturally awakens a desire or a fire within to care for the environment, to work for environmental justice, and it keeps you in touch locally with what is going on in your community. Like you were saying, you're meeting in community gardens and things like that.
Totally, yeah. There's this quote that I love by a Senegalese environmentalist, Baba Dioum, who says, it's something like, we can't save the places we don't love. We can't love the places we don't learn. We can't learn about the places that we don't know, or something like that. Basically that, like, in order to love our place, we need to learn that about that place, and we can't protect our places unless we love them, and so I think that's at the heart of Wild Church as learning to love the place where we call home, and to love that with the love of Creator who, there's that verse in John 3:16 that talks about, for God so loved the world. I think in our minds, at least for me, I grew up thinking God so loved humans, like God so loved us. But the word in Greek is actually cosmos, like for God so loved, that God sent Jesus into the world. And so there's this kind of shifting, I think, that needs to happen, or expansion of what is the world that God loves, and how do we direct our love with that, kind of channeling that love of Creator and receiving that love in return as well.
Yeah. Oh, I got goosebumps thinking about that. For God so loved the cosmos. I've not thought about that before. Yeah, that just blew my mind a little bit. So have you had any experiences with creation, with nature?
Yeah. Oh, I have several stories. Trying to think of which ones to share most, but one that comes to mind, two interconnected ones that come to mind are during a baptism service last year. I had the joy of baptizing my sister, who's been coming to our church, which is really
so special.
And also a younger 12-year-old or so, who has been coming as well, and with his family. And anyway, my sister was working actually on the San Joaquin River doing river restoration for salmon. This spring run Chinook salmon variety of salmon that's the southernmost salmon run. Salmon go all up the Pacific Northwest, and the rivers were traditionally full of salmon before a lot of the rivers were dammed for hydropower or agriculture, for different uses for humans. And then the salmon have been threatened in our region since the 1940s when Friant Dam went up. They can't go to spawn, basically. And there's just literally not enough water in the river, or at least not until recently, for salmon to come up. And that spring was like the first time that salmon returned to the San Joaquin River to spawn naturally, I think, to some section of the river where they weren't trucked farther, because they had to be kind of put in these trucks and moved up the river in order to spawn. Environmental legislation that happened. But yeah, it was like the first time in just decades that they had come back. My sister, was baptized in that river. And at one point earlier that year, they were just within a mile of where we were. She got to see them and work with them. I didn't get a chance, but the salmon has really become kind of a metaphor for Christ for us, in a sense. I gave those who were baptized salmon necklaces. They were like hand-carved wooden necklaces of the Chinook salmon, because kind of like that fish symbol for early Christians. The salmon has sort of become our model of Christ, who's like the salmon, kind of I see as like swimming upstream, like countercultural, against the current of his time and day. Like how he treats women and the oppressed and people who are on the margins, as well as, the sort of nonviolence practice and the ways that Christ just embodied love. And for the sake of life, salmon actually hurl themselves over dams. They swim up. They're transitioning from saltwater to freshwater, which is like really difficult for their bodies. Like their skin is sort of coming off in the process because of this saltwater freshwater transition. And then they lay their eggs upstream and then essentially just die after they spawn. And their bodies and carcasses really enrich the ecosystem, and are different animals feed off of them all up and down the river. And we're really a species in our region for decades. Indigenous peoples, depended on them as well. And but yeah, there's this sense of kind of salmon contribute to the life cycle. They enrich the soil and the region. They're like life-giving animals who give up their lives for the sake of their young. And you could say for the sake of love. which I see the cross as, it's not for the sake of death, of self-sacrifice, but it's for the sake of love. And so in some ways we sort of see Christ's model and sort of pattern our lives off of that. Like, how do we enrich the ecosystem around us, and how can our lives be a part of that in our baptism? So that became like just a really beautiful kind of baptism metaphor for us. And sort of, whenever we think of the salmon or hear of their migrations, can pray for them, can also think of them as a model, and can we see Christ in the salmon as we see Christ in, or those around us. Another creature around the time of baptism that became really special was a hummingbird. When we were preparing for baptism, there was just this hummingbird that was just like hovering above the waters and just sort of watching us and like, looking around. I thought of, the dove that came down.
Oh, yeah.
Luke, maybe at Jesus's baptism, or I'm trying to think of the passage, but it says, the Spirit came down as a dove. And I like that it says the Spirit came down as a dove in bodily form. Like there's a sense of like, God incarnate as a bird hovered over the waters.
Which also gives like Genesis vibes of the Spirit hovering over, like the deep.
Right. And this little hummingbird has just continued to show up. I don't know if it's the same one. There will just be a little hummingbird who just comes and hovers, and I'm like, oh, maybe it's like the Spirit of God is a hummingbird.
Yeah. I feel bad. I don't eat much meat. I try not to. I try to be a vegetarian. I didn't grow up a vegetarian like my spouse, so it's a struggle. But salmon is one of the foods. I mean, I guess it's not meat, but I do eat fish, and salmon is one of the fish that I eat quite a bit. So now I feel bad that now I'm going to think of that I'm eating Jesus, or I think I mean, it just shows that the more in touch you are with creation, the harder it is to exploit it or use it for your own gain.
One other story that I forgot to share was about Eucharist. So when we do communion, I was actually inspired by the book Braiding, Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who talks about her dad's practice of like pouring out a little bit of coffee when they went camping as a sort of gift to the land, or like the land got the first drink. And I thought about like how in communion, if we're widening our understanding of who we're in kinship with and relationship with in Christ in the natural world, if there's, if according to Colossians, Christ is in and through and with and beyond all things, can we share our communion with the rest of the natural world? And so we started offering some of our bread and wine or grape juice back to the land and waters in recognition of the ways that we are interconnected with this greater body and share in the body of Christ together. And then also recognizing the ways that the earth suffers in these times. We pour out some of the blood of the soil. And one time when we tossed out, the bread and then shared the grape juice, some ducks literally came out of the river. And they were probably used to people tossing them bread and like joined our communion feast. And so I loved that there was like this sense of, the birds and the creatures are coming up and expanding our circle of communion and sharing.
That's hilarious.
Sharing in the feast.
They're like, oh yeah, I want to commune with you all.
Yeah. It's usually a very kind of sacred, profound moment, but definitely seeing ducks waddle up brought out some laughter and giggles.
That's so cute. Yeah. You'll have to like I've heard that grapes are better for ducks than bread. And so like, how you have like, sometimes people do grapes and crackers for kids. Instead when you can have grapes for the ducks.
the ducks. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I'm curious if this kind of wild church work, how it intersects with your dismantling the doctrine of discovery, your work with Sarah Augustine, and do you do kind of intentional decolonial work with your church? I didn't prompt you on this question, but I thought about it as you were talking. If that's okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I've come to see Wild Church as a kind of complementary work to the dismantling the doctrine of discovery work I do with the coalition. And just briefly, that coalition started in the Mennonite Church, for those unfamiliar with it, or with people who are Anabaptists who are seeking to respond to Indigenous calls to Christians and to church communities to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, or the legal and philosophical framework that justified colonization and justify the taking of Indigenous lands and ongoing removal and, dispossession of Indigenous peoples of their homelands, and of the kind of extractive mentality and practices, taking out resources for the benefit of both European descendants and Western governments and so on. So I, with that coalition, have been volunteering for a number of years and work part-time with the coalition as well, organizing a repair network of congregations and communities to join in the work of repair and join in restoration of land, and also reparations for the harms that have been done in the name of Christ on Indigenous lands. So we have a number of steps, and you can check out our website, Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, and you can look up Repair Network if you want to look it up. And I see the work of Wild Church as some of the internal work of repair that we need to do for those of us descended mostly from white settler traditions, of seeing ourselves as interwoven with the fabric of creation, of the web of life, that we're not separate or superior. I also think there's a lot of deep work to do for Wild Church communities in terms of learning from Indigenous communities in their region, and to do some of that decolonization as from a place of humility, that we aren't the first ones to sort of have a spiritual connection with the land. Like, we're not just going into this idea that's never
this is not a new concept that you're inventing. Yes. Oh, that's important. Yeah.
We're trying to kind of relearn and sometimes make our own way or make up along the way. But when and whenever possible, if there are Indigenous communities who are open to sharing, or who are open to groups joining or listening and supporting whatever their priorities might be in terms of ecological healing in the region, I think that's really crucial work as part of Wild Church. For us, that's looked like forming a connection actually with someone who reached out to us because he heard a podcast. Yay, podcasts! The Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition podcast interviewed me about a resource that I had edited called Stories of Repair. And this pastor, who is Western Mono and lives in Aubrey area on a rancheria where his ancestors are from. They are one of the local Indigenous groups here. He heard the podcast and felt like, somebody's talking about decolonization and Christianity in ways that he hadn't heard that much in seminary or in the church growing up, and is really seeking his own path as an Indigenous person of decolonizing his faith and Christianity, which is, I think, a process that has led him to relearning some of the language and learning some of the cultural traditions, and seeking to kind of revitalize some of the practices, even just like musical instruments or different things that missionaries or just the Western tradition had either banned or looked down on or seen as associated as demonic. And so he actually has started, through a connection with him, he started coming to wild church with his family as part of a seminary internship. And then I've gone and supported the church that he's seeking to restart at the Rancheria, and just, done a lot of listening. We meet and have just a prayer partnership relationship. And he's come and shared most recently about acorn and how important acorn as a staple food source is in the region, and helped us form a connection with the oak trees that are really being impacted by drought and are suffering because of the loss of traditional cultural burning of indigenous peoples in our region. That's been one of the sources of the huge wildfires, along with just the mega drought, is that there's so much underbrush, and so much of the land hasn't been maintained by periodic cultural burns, that the wildfires are way more destructive than they ever have been before. But yeah, he's taught us about fire and, use of fire on the landscape. We've also had the chance to invite in another Indigenous teacher who works in the community to share whatever we just kind of opened it up. What do you want to share with us? What's important? Gather by the river and seek to reknit our connection with this place. Like, what stories do you want to share with us? And she shared a number of stories from her own family, and some painful stories, and also some beautiful, Yokut stories and other Indigenous groups in the area about some of the animals in our region, about some of the creation stories that they have here in connection to the land. And for us, learning from Indigenous peoples like Darlene's her name, or like Aunich, the pastor I spoke of, and others, is an important practice. And it feels like one that we're just kind of in the beginning phases of doing this kind of relearning and replacing ourselves as immigrants and settlers, as learners and as guests on lands that are not ours to own.
Yeah. That sounds like incredible work. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I'm really passionate about, and I see this as work is really connected with decolonization. And we live in an area where here in the West, there was a genocide that's never been publicly acknowledged. The state put over $1 million towards bounties for Indigenous people's scalps, and towards killing of Indigenous, women and children and men. And, there was just there's no further west to remove people. So we're in California. And yeah, it is one of the most biologically diverse places, ecologically diverse places that has been stewarded and tended by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. So just the huge loss of Indigenous stewardship and management practices, so many Indigenous people had to kind of go underground or assimilate or just survive. They're still here and really trying to rebuild their language and culture and communities. But yeah, I just think of, what if the church really rose up as truth tellers in this time about what's happened, as well as people who are committed to restoration of Indigenous lands and cultures, and where Indigenous peoples could be restored to that place of leadership and of offering the kind of traditional ecological wisdom gleaned from thousands of years in place that our world really needs right now in this time of ecological collapse that isn't separate from colonization, I think, like in terms of the roots of the collapse.
Yes, bringing together the connections of colonization and environmental destruction. They're often talked about separately, but bringing those two together.
When Charlie taught us about, or when Aunich, taught us about acorn, his Western Mono name, he actually shared some acorn meal that one of the people on his rancheria makes as a business, and is trying to restore some of those traditional foodways. So we got to taste acorn meal this past week and shared it around among some different Wild Church friends, and we baked some acorn meal into our communion bread. So we were kind of
neat
seeing that, like, that direct sense of connection with the oak trees and with the sense of connection with Indigenous peoples past and present, who've used this for thousands of years too as a sacred food source. So in some ways, how do we...
Sorry, I'm freaking out a little bit of just like the theological implications of baking this acorn meal into communion, like Christ and creation coming together. I don't know. There's something beautiful there.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't just like bread from Kroger or something. It was It was really bread
with just
from our place, like body of Christ and body of earth together. So I think for me too, as someone who grew up in the church, I needed to kind of heal myself from church's obligation. And church is something that is just like, okay, it's just something that you do on Sunday and you go through the motions and kind of get it over with. But I was like, I'm not encountering a sense of the divine presence here. Like, I think I wanted and longed for that sense of just reconnection and not just kind of going through the motions, even though I think practice is important and sometimes you don't always feel it. You don't always feel something. Yeah, but I think also it's also slowing down and simplifying. Like, all of what we think of as church essential. Like, I caught up in so many meetings so quickly when I'm, part of organizations or church communities or committees or work that feels so important and necessary, but then sometimes can just become extra baggage or burden.
Yeah.
And to me, Wild Church is about kind of slowing down and centering. We don't have Sunday school. Sorry, parents. They actually have said they enjoy having their kids with them. We've got
more intergenerational.
And
if they are involved in the service, it's not a battle of like having them sit still and pay attention. I would imagine if they're more involved, then they don't struggle paying attention, or there's more going on. They can look at the birds and the squirrels, and they don't struggle to like
poke things with a stick. Yeah.
So why do you think some might view this topic as bad or unusual? Have you ever been accused of worshiping creation rather than worshiping God? Or what's kind of the nugget of resistance that might pop up with Wild Church?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think first, when people hear Wild Church, there may be sometimes you get kind of like awkward glances or like or a giggle or something, and I'm like, oh, I wonder if people think that we're like, I don't know, out dancing naked around a fire or something. Like,
you're like, we're wild, but not that wild, okay?
Yeah, I enjoy skinny dipping in private on my own, but I'm not like out there.
It's promoting public nudity.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
But I think maybe that sense of wild is sort of, people out there like dancing in the moonlight or something. But I think that your second question about like worshiping creation rather than God maybe is more of that like resistance point for some Christians or for some people. I haven't heard it from people within Wild Church who come like as a concern or something. I think they're just drawn to the outdoors because that's where they feel most connected with the divine and with Creator. But I have heard some people ask, are you worshiping trees? Or I think it's a question, though, that reveals a lot, because when people worship inside of a building, I don't ask them, do you worship a building rather than God?
Oh, so good. Yes.
To the altar when
Touche.
versus like, if people
Yes.
ask if we bow down to trees, somehow it's a concern when the wood is alive versus when it's like pulpit or something. So why is it an issue that suddenly when it's outdoors? I think it actually a deeper inherited fear perhaps of paganism or of even indigenous spiritualities of I think there are some verses in the Old Testament that talk about people who worship created things rather than God. But I see it as I often say we worship with creation, or we worship with trees, as a sense of kind of reviving some of the Psalms, for example, or other passages in Scripture that talk about like the mountains and the hills clap their hands, or there's a sense of animism and that the earth is alive that we've somehow lost in these like post-enlightenment times. I'm sure many books can tell you about the origin of that, of sort of when did matter become dead rather than like a living, breathing earth, and a sense of creation as part of the chorus, that birds and fish and river can sing praises to Creator, or can groan, with the groaning pains that Romans talks about, that Jesus says, if people don't acknowledge who I am, that even the stones will cry out. So, so I just find so much more life and energy when I'm walking or, in a group of people outdoors, and we have this sense that that the rest of creation is worshiping with us, or is part of our table, part of our communion, rather than seeing like we're what matters, or it feels very lonely and somewhat afraid to feel like it's just us and God as humans, but that there's a living, breathing earth that we're interconnected with and that we're called to care for and be cared for by. God also, I guess I would consider myself as a more panentheist. So pantheism is sort of like conflates God and creation, and like God is the earth. Panentheism is more of God is both transcendent and immanent in theology speak, of like God can be both beyond and other and free, and God is also takes on creaturely flesh, like in and like in the created world. So I think Jesus I see as if Jesus is human and divine and creaturely as well. There's a sort of flesh sharing among other created beings as well, like the dove over Jesus's baptism that we talked about, or other incarnation is incarnation into the earth and the dust and the soil, and the plants and other animals as well. So yeah, and I think that's I don't know. I think that's maybe threatening or bad to some folks. I think there's some work within Christianity that we've got to do around like what is that deep-rooted fear of nature. I think there's fear of a sort of wild power and connection with the earth that's been seen in like the burning of witches and women who are connected with nature, or that power, or a fear of indigenous communities who are have a connection with the spiritual world and their own places, because they're seen as pagans, and missionaries have burnt their. I've talked with indigenous communities missionaries have burnt their ceremonial items before, and are seen as worshiping earth or worshiping spirits. So so I feel something there that in the innocent question, I want to probe that a little bit more, and maybe that's some more writing down the line.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. What a good bad topic. So what would you say if someone said that you were a bad pastor for worshiping outside and caring about this wild church community?
Uh, I probably would say like I embrace my wild side, you know? Like I believe we worship a wild God. And like who it's not really about me or my own wildness. Like that's people are welcome to see me as they choose, but I do feel that can we reclaim some of God's wildness that's undomesticated, you know, that's not constrained by our buildings or by our human technologies or by our ability to, you know, control or manipulate God into like our own packages or containers about who God is. Like I think of actually there's a passage in Acts that talks about Lydia meeting with a group of like the early church by the river, and like they encountered God in Acts by the river. And you know, I think God's presence with the people of Israel guiding escaped slaves out with a pillar of fire and smoke, like that's wild, you know, or the burning bush, you know, or like
there's so much biblical precedent for wild church, for encountering God in the wilderness.
The wilderness, like wilderness tradition of the prophets. Jesus, you know, and John the Baptist kind of coming out of the wilderness. And Jesus, how often does Jesus teach in the synagogues? Like we often see him in boat or on hillsides or walking and
on the way,
when we lose that connection, you know. So I think wild church is about rewilding our relationship with the Creator and the natural world, and returning, I guess you could say, returning to a wild God.
Well, would it be okay, Katerina, if I bless you and all of our wild, beautiful baddies out there?
Thank you. Definitely.
Okay. Katerina and all of you baddies, may you go from this episode with your wild spirit ignited. May you step into the desire to connect with the wildness of creation and of our wild and bad and beautiful Creator God. May you breathe fresh air. May you appreciate water and hummingbirds and salmon, and find this returning, this reconnecting to what brings life. Amen.
Thank you, Mariah.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.